Welcome to all of you today to today's webinar hosted by the IHSS, the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen Mary. It's a real pleasure to welcome our main speaker today, Daniel Steinmetz-Jenkins, who's currently a postdoctoral fellow in history at Dartmouth College and managing editor, of course, at Modern Intellectual History. And also Marietta D C, also a postdoctoral fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford. Both have made hugely important contributions on the nature of the relationship to religion and politics, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to their thoughts today. They're going to be properly introduced in a moment by our chair and fellow discussant for today, Jon Adenitre, a lawyer by training, who's made his own contributions to these same questions here at Queen Mary. Jon's also one of our IHSS strategic lecturers, and so I'm delighted he's agreed to take on the task of stewarding today's discussion. Jon's got a new book out himself on the general right to conscientious exemption, which seeks to remove the religious privileges attached to this. His work, just like the others, raises important questions around the nature of liberal consensus and dissensus and how we manage that in political society. Now, not another talk on populism. I hear some of you may be saying, I almost wonder whether in the context of COVID and government lockdowns, the populists have not in some ways been out-paranoided, and whether there are perhaps signs of some more positive civic pragmatism bursting through. If so, or if not, perhaps even more so, then getting to grips with the nature of belief as a part of that will be pretty critical. And so I'm sure today will be no ordinary talk on the subject. Much looking forward to what all of you have to say. Thanks for sharing your time and thoughts with us. And Jon, I'll hand over to you to give our speakers a proper introduction. But thank you from me, Simon Reed-Henry.
Thank you so much, Simon, for the kind introduction. In fact, that introduction was so perfect that I will not be doing further introductions of our speakers. Perhaps if there are some items about themselves that they want to let known, they can publicize that in when they speak. Just a brief introduction to the format of today. We shall be finishing at 3 p.m. That's the aim. And Daniel will talk for 10 minutes, summarizing the paper that he presented and is going to present now. And then Marietta and I will spend around 10 minutes each responding to that presentation. Daniel will then have 5 minutes or so to respond if he wishes to what Marietta and I have to say. And then for the last 25 minutes or so, we will open the floor to our audience. If you do wish to raise a question, please put it in the chat or write to me through the chat privately, outlining your question. That would be appreciated. So no further introductions needed. Daniel, you have the floor.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here, Simon and Jon and Marietta. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this project and the paper, which tries to look at populism from a, if you will, secular studies perspective. And I probably need to explain what that is, but I just want to make 3 or 4 points because I only have 10 minutes. And the first point is that, and I talk about this in the paper and it's in the description as well. When we think of the crisis of liberalism or the crisis of democracy literature that emerged after Brexit or on account of Trump's election, I typically, at least the way that I read it, it seemed to me that the way that the crisis was being explained was either through politics or through economics. So populism really is a problem of political representation. That seems to be the argument of Jan Werder Müller's book, What is Populism? Many others as well, Yascha Mounk. So that if the diagnosis is that this is a political problem of political representation, that representatives aren't representing their constituents, they're too involved in DC insider politics, or they're too involved with the machinations of the EU. This would suggest that the party system is not functioning properly, and that if the party system is fixed, then the political system of representation will function better, and therefore ultimately this is really a political problem. So that seemed to be a major line of argumentation about how populism had, the appeal of populists. The populist comes in from the outside and says, you know, the system isn't functioning. These politicians don't have your best interest in mind. We represent the people. I represent what you want. So that's the political explanation. And then the economic explanation, I think, for populism, which can be found mainly on the left, but now seems to have a great deal of popularity, at least here in the United States amongst certain Republicans, is that this is a problem of distribution and growing wealth inequality. And that if we can somehow have a better system of wealth distribution and decrease inequality, then the kind of populist rhetoric about Davos elites will be quelled, and that people will feel more like they're involved in political life itself. So ultimately, this is an explanation that tries to focus on wealth distribution. And I think those explanations are powerful. And I'm not here today to discredit them and say this is all about religion. And that's just certainly not the argument that I'm making. But it does seem a little peculiar to me, especially given how many populists appeal to religion and how many religious citizens actually vote for populist, that the relationship between religion and populism in this literature, some of which was quite popular, is not even discussed, or just discussed under the rubric of fascism. And that is the kind of pushback that this paper tries to it tries to push back against just merely these two explanations, political or economic, and look at the relationship between religion and populism. And by making that move, I suggest that really we have to go, and this is the second point, we have to go beyond the 2008 financial crisis, which a lot of people point to, and we have to go beyond Brexit and things of that nature, and look at the kind of anti-totalitarian coalitions that began to fall apart in the early 90s as a consequence of the Cold War ending. And the first part of the paper looks at two examples. I look at the radical orthodoxy movement in Britain and what I could describe as post-liberal theology in the United States, associated with Duke Divinity School, Hauerwasianism, after Stanley Hauerwas, a theologian, and suggest that quite quickly, these groups, and I can point to others as well, wanted to kind of revert back to a position prior to the 1930s and 1920s, more of a 19th century view, which viewed liberalism as a great threat, or with a great deal of suspicion, if you will, towards religious traditionalism, right? So these movements saw in secularism, for instance, not an ally, but in fact they thought of it as a threat to the particularity of the Christian faith, and they targeted secularism, right? And they said that for far too long the churches had kind of made faith secondary to the Cold War, to put it in the most simple way, and that there wasn't a need to do that anymore, right? And that in doing that, you lose it explains the failures of the faith, right? The reason why it's losing is because it's succumbed to this grand narrative. And I want to argue that something like this critique after 9/11 exploded. This is the third point, especially in post-colonial studies, that now that the Cold War is over, for many groups, religious groups, it was Marxism was no longer seen as a threat. It was actually the imperialism of the United States and secular liberalism, right? And you have, and I talk about in the paper, the writings of Talal Saad, who was in fact very much influenced by John Milbank and others, Mahmoud. It's kind of it views these things through the prism of intellectual history. I have to say that, the paper. But in a nutshell, this, I argue, is just in many ways, a further disentwining of anti-totalitarianism, right? That's continuing to work itself out. And the last point is just that in many ways, the liberal critique of populism is not that much different than longstanding liberal critiques of religion's role in the public sphere. If you look at the solution that many liberals are offering for populism, which is that somehow we have to push this back, that you know, I mentioned the political explanation for populism, which is that the party system isn't functioning properly, and therefore you get the fringe moving into the center. Well, that sounds very similar to longstanding liberal critiques of political theology, right? So, and also many of the populist critiques of liberalism sound very similar, in fact, to longstanding religious critiques of secularism. And it's not by coincidence, I argue, that in fact, almost all the major populists, it seems to me, with some exceptions, are very critical of secularism, right? And so, so in some ways, I think maybe there's another angle to this that we can take that doesn't deny the legitimacy and the power of the political and economic explanations for populism, but tries to complement them through looking at the actual beliefs and practices of religious citizens who seem to be, not all, but many seem to be quite taken with populist leadership. To write them all off as fascists, for example, QAnon, I mean, you could say this is fascism, okay, fine, but it might be better to say, well, is this not in keeping with long-standing traditions of the occult in the United States and millenarian doctrines that go back, that we saw in the 19th century, that, you know, we've had many of these movements before, such as the Waco movement. Granted that it was off on the real fringes, but you know, to look seriously at the beliefs instead of just you know, jettisoning them as fascist, which many of them probably are. But I think you have to look at the practices a little bit more seriously if you're wanting to find solutions, perhaps. And that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that very clear explanation of the paper, which, although was not pre-circulated, I think you've done justice in summarizing the main points of. Okay, thank you, Daniel, again. And now let's move to Marietta for our comment on those views.
Thank you, John, and also thank you, Danny, for your paper, which of course I've read with great interest, as the topic of religion and populism is one that is close to my research as well. I think I would like to respond to your paper with a focus on the tension between secularism and perhaps Christianism, in distinction from Christianity as such. I've been thinking a lot about anti-secular sentiments within some of the Christian traditions, partly because of the connection that you indicate between religious discontents and populists, but also partly because the connection between Christian belief and populism is all but straightforward. When we talk about anti-secular sentiments, we tend to refer to a loosely defined group of people that we call evangelicals, especially in the United States. But when we look at Europe, for example, it is also the case that anything beyond nominal Christianity is barely tolerated in right-wing political parties. The multiplicity of contexts, as well as different cleavages of Christian belonging, make a direct comparative analysis actually quite difficult to shape, I think. I think you're quite right about the theologians like John Milbank and Stanley Hauerwas. They both are in their own ways discontented with secularism and try to reassert perhaps an explicit Christian identity in public space. But they too represent two very different strands of Christianity. Milbank and the radical orthodoxy group is a mostly Anglican group who have been part of the establishment for centuries. And Hauerwas comes from a non-conformist background where personal piety tends to take precedent above state interests. So two very different kinds of discontent. This brings me to the tension between Christianism and secularism. I think, Danny, when you talk about the crisis of secularism, I sense a bit of a normative ring to this phrasing, as if there was secularism which is criticized for some Christians, and now we see that secularism may be under threat. I think what is important is that both secularism and Christianism, in their political sense, tend to move in the territory of ideology. And ideology, I believe, is not an end in itself for the state. I think this is important to keep in mind, because it's very easy for either to move into the territory of tyranny, as the late John Laws would put it. Rather, I would suggest that historically, religion and secularity are not as much separated as much as contending on a spectrum that society can push in different directions, and that sometimes tends to get a bit of balance. For example, most emerging constitutional states, I mean, in this context, European states primarily, went through different phases in which greater secularity and religious backlash alternated, as it were, which, by the way, had some proto-populist overtones already in the late 19th century, but then followed by a recalibration of constitutional arrangements, mostly around the turn of the century. What interests me is that these processes of back and forth often concern the visibility of religion in public space as a marker of specific national identity. Looking again at people like Hauerwas and Milbank, they are really voices in much longer strands of thought that have been critical of the demise of Christian influence on the state, as in Milbank, or critical of the legal character of the state, which means that the state could compel believers potentially to do things that are at odds with their beliefs, as in Hauerwas. And I do think that the lament of the deconfessionalization of political life has often been invigorated in response to specific challenges in law and in case law. And often this is mediated through cases concerning women's bodies. I think we need to be careful to understand this particular period that you describe, Danny, as one symptom of anti-secularism, and that the issues that underlie it are much older and really precede the 20th century by quite a long time. So to come back, a final comment to the normativity of secularism. When you talk about the crisis of secularism, I think I would invite you to consider these longer historical lines, as well as the fierce disagreement that exists within Christian communities, has existed, still exists. Not all Christians are against constitutions, liberalism, or even secularism. And many would actually dread a situation in which the theology of rivaling churches would gain ground in the law. I think taking into account the non-priority of ideology or religion and the complexity of Christian responses and engagement with secularism or equally liberalism, I think helps us to be perhaps a bit more precise about the historical moment that you engage. That as a critical remark, but thank you again for your paper, and I look forward to conversation.
Thank you, Marietta. That was a very succinct, but I would say powerful invitation to Daniel. And actually, I think in my own brief comments, which I'll give now, I can perhaps build on your invitation to Daniel to explore the historical roots of this conflict that we see nowadays. And so I totally agree with Daniel that with his analysis that there's something going on, that there's a long-standing academic critique of what he calls secularism, what both Daniel and Marietta call secularism, and they have given examples of some of that critique in post-colonial scholars, but also in I guess more theology-based scholars like Milbank, and that this critique of secularism goes well in hand with a critique, well, with the rise of populist movement. And as Daniel says, a good, even though not exclusive, explanation of that rise of populism is a religious one, because as for example, Trump in the US with this insistence on Christian evangelical, I would say, or values, resurgence of these values in public life, in political life. And in Europe, we have many examples many other examples. I'll just point to Poland, to the Law and Justice Party, which is making a big resurgence and combining the resurgence of Catholicism, Polish Catholicism, with in public life, in political life. So yes, just to summarize again, there's a long-standing critique of secularism, and there's a new wave, though is not only to our own times. Yes, there's a new wave of populist movements that combine with new, let's say, religious fervor. And to accept Marietta's invitation to look back into history, though through, I want to accept that invitation, though adopt not necessarily the historical method, but the intellectual historical method, right? To trace back these conflicts in the history of ideas. And in order to do that, I have to reconfigure a little bit of the terminology that has been used here. So both Daniel and Marietta have been talking about a crisis or a critique of secularism, but they have sometimes alluded to a critique of liberalism. In fact, I think that the real term here is, rather than secularism itself, is liberalism, and I shall explain that in a second. And this rise of the populist movement, I'd want to place it in a conflicting ideology with liberalism, which is what I will refer to as political theology, i.e. the idea, which I will explain in more depth in a second, that politics and theology are not to be confused. So let's explain more what I intend as liberalism and what I intend as political theology, and then see how they relate back to Daniel's point. So by liberalism, I intend the idea that the main value of a political system is personal freedom, right? And we can trace that back to the work of Locke and John Stuart Mill. And liberalism created itself, or asserted itself, in opposition to political theology. How did it do that? Both in the work of Mill, but earlier in Locke, and perhaps in other earlier work, which I will not concern with myself with today. They did something. They separated the political from the theological, right? So they separated the domain of God from the domain of the magistrate. And in so doing, they instituted the political domain as a domain of individual freedom, of freedom of thought, of freedom of conscience, and of freedom of what we call today religion, that each person can make their own mind and pursue their own ideas of the good, the right, of the eternal, of the non-eternal, right? And that the state has to respect that within limits, that individual liberty, right? And this comes really powerfully in the work of Locke, by separating the power of the magister and the power of the church. So there's a clear break. Whereas political theology does not accept this break, does not accept that there is a break between the politics and the common good. In fact, the idea of political theology is that the idea of the good and the right given by divinity or divinities is the supreme value of a political system. So here, there is no, just as in liberalism, there is a distinction between the political and the theological. In political theology, there is no distinction between the theological and the political. Religion is the state, and the state is religion. So we find that in real terms nowadays in certain theocracies, like in Iran, or in a certain sense in the Vatican. Right. So we have seen then, I hope, that these two strands of thought, the political theology and liberalism. And the way liberalism asserts itself is by requiring the state to recognize, to guarantee the legal right of conscience, of religion, of thought, and other standard liberal rights. And the purpose of religious freedom in this context is to manage political theology, to restrict the tendency of those that advocate for political theology to take over the political domain. Yes. So religious freedom is a management tool rather than a liberating tool. And this comes across in the work of many scholars of modern scholars of religion. Right, that religious freedom is kind of a chain on those that identify as religious. I totally take this critique. So because religious freedom is a chain on a form of government, on a form of political theology, we can see that the populist movement, a la Trump or la Law and Justice Party in Poland, is a way to break away from those chains of liberalism, right? And so Daniel's point that we need a religious explanation of this populist movement, that we need to take seriously the beliefs and the practices of this populist movement is actually very, very accurate, right? But as Marietta says, we need to go back to history, to the rise of liberalism and to the purposes of liberalism vis-a-vis political theology in order to understand this continuing conflict that we see today and we presumably have seen for a long time. Okay, so I'll just finish by making this last point that, and this is more relevant to perhaps the lawyers in the room, there's been a strand in legal thought, in critical legal studies, but also more broadly, that because of these critiques that I've pointed out about religious freedom, that religious freedom is really a chain on those that are religious, that the law should do without religious freedom, right? In order to break these chains. But I don't think we should be so quick to break these chains, because the price of reading the law of the category of religious freedom is that we are reading ourselves at the same time of a management tool on political theology. And political theology is problematic from a liberal perspective, is the prime nemesis of liberals. So I think the liberals, those that are that subscribe to the ideology of liberalism, should not be so quick, or at least without a good alternative, to advocate for reading ourselves of religious freedom as a legal category. Okay, I think that concludes my own statement. I would now welcome Daniel to perhaps give a response to our contribution before we open the floor. And can I just invite our audience to please write to me in the chat, or write in the chat if you want to raise a point.
Well, first of all, many thanks to Marietta and John for great comments, and really gives me a lot to think about, and I appreciate the observations and pushing me to think through some of these things. So I just want to say, I mean, yes, of course, when it comes to religion and liberalism, this debate goes back to the Reformation, you could argue, or at least the way that we might think about religious freedom and some of these long-term issues involving the relationship between liberalism and I mean, religion in the modern state. That's 100% the case. And I'm just really focused on the 1990s and trying to figure out trying to figure out an explanation that really goes, that we can trace back to the end of the Cold War. And it seems to me the figures that I pointed to early on, especially Stanley Hauerwas, the main figure that he directs his criticisms towards is Reinhold Niebuhr, the Cold War liberal theologian, right? I mean, a major figure of the Cold War in terms of articulating political realism and a very particular view of Protestantism's role in American life, right? And so I don't really think you can understand Milbank or Niebuhr. And let me just simply say it's true that there are differences between Milbank and Niebuhr, but if you look at the Radical Orthodoxy series that was published, half of the books were published by John Milbank's students. Hauerwas, and there's a great cross-pollination between these two schools of thought. There are differences, but I mean, basically Hauerwas is a Bardian. He's inspired by Bard, and Milbank takes his inspirations from elsewhere. But there's enough there to point to some common concerns about the liberal state that I think the argument can get off the ground. And just a few more remarks. You know, in many ways, just listening to what John's saying, I mean, this is really this whole conundrum that I'm trying to unpack between the relationship between religion and Cold War liberalism, and then it's kind of the disentwining of these coalitions that's during the 90s and what we're seeing today. This is really, in some ways, the bet that liberals were willing to take in terms of aligning themselves with groups that served their purposes during the Cold War, but could later come back to bite them. And that seems to be most certainly the case with evangelicalism in the United States, which entered into the Reagan coalition in the late 1970s. When it served them to do so, weren't mobilized before that, not as cohesively at least, and then now has become the biggest defenders of Trumpism, right? Of course, we're talking about the Republican Party here, but in the context of the Cold War, this was a part of a kind of in some sense, this kind of just piggybacks on John's comments that this is the price to pay in some ways for religious freedom, at least in terms of the comment that he sent my way, that religious freedom allows for this space, but it can quickly be utilized for, I think John describes it as political theology. And isn't it interesting, in the 1990s and 2000s, we have the revival of political theology and a literal obsession with the writings of Carl Schmitt. And there's a real interest in political theology, which not at that level, did not really exist, I think, during the Cold War. You have to go back to the 20s and 30s. I just want to reiterate that really this is an attempt to look at the legacy of anti-totalitarianism and the falling apart of that coalition, and using that as a way of explaining the crisis of liberalism and democracy today, and then suggesting that many of the longstanding critiques of populism map on to longstanding critiques that liberals have had of religion in general, that maybe were put to the side because of the Cold War, but now have become of dire importance today, right? So I think I'll leave it at that, but that's just to, I think it complements just what both of you are saying. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I think you're right that there's no big disagreement between the three panelists today. In fact, I'm delighted that we are kind of making a common case. Yes, just asking for more sophistication, perhaps. That's if I can summarize Marietta's points as well. So one of our participants, Mark, if I can say this correctly, Mark Valenta, asked Daniel whether you can comment on this point, which is populists today. They of course critique secularism or liberalism more generally, but they are equally critical towards those that within their own religious faction, right, that dissent. So they are critical both within and outside their own factions. So they do not seem to be very receptive to differences of theological opinion. Perhaps you have something to say. And I hope, Mark Valenta, I summarized your question appropriately.
Well, I mean, I can maybe best answer that by what I know about, which is the dilemma of so-called never Trump evangelicals and pro-Trump evangelicals in this country, and the crisis of faith that has arisen and because of Trump. So it's absolutely the case that there is no universal agreement within these faith communities on populist leaders. It has created real divisions without a doubt. But it seems to me that one of the interesting things that kind of maps on to some of what I'm saying, in a longstanding comes to thinking about secularism, liberalism, is that most of the pro-Trump or the never Trump evangelicals are college educated, and many of them, at least the most outspoken ones, are writing for Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine. And many of the most pro-Trump evangelicals aren't a part of that world at all. So in some sense, this is in keeping with a critique that in a certain sense, college education and plays a role in explaining the appeal of, at least in the United States and maybe in other places, of populist leadership. It's not so much earnings, income, but often ideology, you could say, I suppose. So yeah, but I 100% agree that this isn't down the line in terms of all religious people wanting these populists.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that's also partially a response to what Marietta had earlier invited me to expand on. We have another question, which is from Lucy Skinner, that says, thank you, that thanks us for the discussion, but also asks, do you think the divisive effects of populism within religions like Christianity are more destructive to the religion than secularism itself? Yeah, I'll invite, of course, Daniel, but perhaps Marietta also has something that she wants to contribute. And if there are other members of the audience that want to raise other questions, please feel free to either post it in the chat or raise your hand, so you can feel free to ask the question directly.
Maybe Marietta has thoughts. I have thoughts, but I've been talking so much.
Well, this is your session, Daniel, so we'd love to hear from you. But I do have some thoughts. Maybe what I would say is that, yes, you could see it as a threat to Christianity, that there is this divisiveness. But I think there's also the possibility to make a case that it actually makes some people within religious traditions think a bit harder about what it is that they're looking for in the political and in the public space. I think the intellectual tradition, especially of Protestantism, has been exceptionally lazy. And I can say that I'm kind of a Protestant myself, so I think I can say that out loud. I think that is a tradition that has not been known for its intellectual richness. And I think one of the things that this divisiveness has brought about is, I think, a renewed interest in the foundations of political life and how different Christian traditions relate to that. That doesn't mean that people reach very different conclusions, but the fact that there is this renewed attention and this renewed debate, I think is actually helpful in the long term, even if it looks very messy right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you hear, especially anti-populist concerned Christian citizens or religious citizens in general say out of fear that this involves a fair bit of hypocrisy and you're going to lose your children because of it. And, you know, this is why the interwar period is so powerful on so many different levels, because they'll point to Weimar and say this discredited the churches and led to a growing disillusionment with the churches. But there's no necessity for something like that, and in terms of it actually happening. And I'm not so sure that this will have those types of consequences. I'm just speaking here in the United States. So it's just it's difficult to say, because clearly there are plenty of people who are sticking to their guns, and whatever the Capitol stormers on 1/6 doesn't seem to have much in terms of consequences for many. So it's hard to say. I mean, but yes, of course, historically speaking, sure, but.
Thank you, both Daniel and Marietta. We have another question, and that is from David Klemperer. I hope I pronounced that properly. Ask you, Daniel, to draw out what you see as the impact of Milbank and Auerbach outside of the academy, and how this impact was exercised. And I think that goes back to my own comment, which was that, of course, there's been a long tradition of criticism, academic criticism of secularism, but as this academic criticism, as it become, is it the cause of the populist rise, or is it just allied to it? Yes. So the academics, that they have an impact on a life impact, so to speak, on the populist movement.
Well, I think Philip Blond comes to mind, a Red Tory who's a student of John Milbank, one-to-one connection there, I think. Although there seems to be, I don't even know if this terminology, radical orthodoxy, is even used. I mean, this was a movement that seemed to really have its apogee was in the early 2000s, and that series that I mentioned is no longer, I think, going. But I mean, that would be an instance, and of course with Milbank, he's working at a divinity school, so I can simply say, knowing some of these communities, yes, he helped inspire an intentional community movement in the United States, very much inspired by kind of Mennonite theology that very much had implications for the way people viewed the state, whether they voted. I don't think this went in a Trumpist direction necessarily. I don't think that at all. Usually these are quite passive. This is a pacifist tradition. But more generally, I think what would it take to answer a question like that, and that would be part of the project, which I'm just at the initial stages, would be to look at some of the influences of these ideas. I think, especially when it comes to, Talha Saad, Saba Mahmood, some of their students, I think some of the work has already been done on how they've shaped some of their students who have gone back to various places and in the Middle East in particular. So yeah, I don't think it's merely academics, and kind of the work that a lot of liberals have done when talking about reckless minds and during the Cold War, those like Sartre or whoever who supported these communist, radical political ideologies. How could they do this? Look at their influence. Liberals were really into this literature in the 90s. Tony Judt in particular wrote a whole book saying how in the world could so many French intellectuals support Marxism? Like, these people are fools, like, and look at their influence. I think it's something like that probably needs to be done with liberals who supported the Iraq War, but I also think it can be done with some of the students. You know, again, these are. I do think there's a practical element to this, and especially since some of this is taking place in divinity schools, where the whole point is vocational, not being an academic. So, yeah, but it's a good point, and part of the argument is just to suggest that many of the academics who have written about the crisis of liberalism and the crisis of populism, who seem to be so surprised by this. It's been in the literature for a couple decades, and it's just maybe the places where maybe, and it wasn't just Marxists and leftists. That would be the easy answer. It was actually there all along, I think, and maybe in places where, perhaps because of a secular bias, where many folks weren't looking.
Marietta, please.
I think one of the thoughts that comes to mind, particularly in association with Hauerwas and the circle around Duke Divinity, is the surge of the language of counterculturality, both within the United States and increasingly so in Europe. And I think what is interesting about this language is that it kind of goes along with this distinction between the common and where a particular religious tradition might sit. So it's a way of kind of imagining yourself outside of the order, even, if I put it broadly. And I think what is really important is that I think this is a two-way street, that churches learn, perhaps, or religious traditions learn how to better be part of the common without their own ideas taking priority over those of others. So it's not a matter of excluding, but maybe a matter of knowing your place around the table. That's not just about you, but also to open up the common good to various religious ideas and values. And this is not just an issue for Christian religions, but I think also for other religions in Europe, especially with regard to Islam, where Islam is very much put as the enemy of liberalism, the enemy of constitutionalism, or in France, the enemy of the Republic. It's all very much kind of framed like a binary. And I think if we truly seek for a common story, we need to find ways to integrate the concerns of different minorities, I think, a little bit better than we have in the past.
Thank you for that contribution, Marietta, and of course, Daniel. We have another question, perhaps the one of the last questions, because our time is, we are reaching almost the end of the session. So Pedro Feitosa suggests that objections to secularism and secularization have been made by other scholars other than the radical theology ones. So, and this includes subalternal study scholars, especially their critique of historicism, and certain sociologists like David Martin's idea in the 1960s to eliminate the concept of secularization from the vocabulary of sociology. So Pedro wonders whether this these critiques could be added to your explanation, Daniel.
Thank you for the question. And it's the failure is mine because I didn't explain in enough to tell the part of the paper that has to do with the Iraq War and the critique of secularism coming from subaltern studies and post-colonial studies that I kind of deal with at length. And so absolutely, part of what's interesting to me is that many coming from subaltern studies were committed Marxists early on. And then Marxism is itself a kind of form of it is a form of secularism, and there's this move away from that amongst some. I think Tal Assad would be an instance, to a critique of secularism, which seems to go in the direction of religious-based traditionalism, and that a part of that is inseparable from. This had been worked out way before the Iraq War in his case, but the book Formations of the Secular, I think that's what it's called. It can't be really understood, I think, without what happened in the early 2000s and with the critique of American imperialism and liberal internationalism. So absolutely, that is the case. And I don't think it's incompatible. I think it actually goes quite well with what I'm saying, especially since in the book I just mentioned by Assad, he references Milbank in a very positive way. And if you look at, I've written about this, many of the critiques coming from subaltern studies of secularism seem to rely a lot on Catholic critiques of secularism, interestingly enough. And rely often in terms of some of the thinking about practice in particular, if you look at Saleh Mahmoud or others, on McIntyre and his book After Virtue. So, so there's definitely a lot there. It can't be reduced just to what I said alone, because there's other strains of thought influencing it, but there's enough of a connection to where I think you can connect this anti-totalitarianism that I'm argument I'm making in the 90s to the 2000s as well. So, and then David Martin and, the simple fact is that every single year a Pew study appears saying that the United States or Europe is becoming more religious, and then the next year it will appear and say it's becoming less religious. This kind of approach to the question never seem all that convincing to me, because the data seems to fluctuate so much. But what I'm saying is that just in terms of populists themselves, whether it's Erdogan, Modi, the Pentecostals who love Bolsonaro, Orban, you cannot deny the connection between what they are between the positive political vision and what seems across the board to be a critique of secularism. It's just in every instance it's there. About once a week I go on Google and I do a Google News search of secularism, and maybe this is just not a very it doesn't prove anything, but I find it remarkable that when I do this Google News search, 8 out of 10 things that appear on each page have to do with secularism in India and the crisis of secularism in India. It's almost always in the Indian context. And it just kind of proves the point to me that there is a strong connection, and it maps on very well to longstanding minority-majority conflict in these areas between minority secularists and educated elites versus the majority who share maybe the dominant religious tradition, and they feel like there's a disconnect. Isn't that not part of an essential feature of populism, anti-elitism at the educated elite who's typically trained in the West? That seems to, again, kind of go quite well with some of the arguments that I'm making.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think that actually addresses, though indirectly, the follow-up question by Pedro, which is, does the emergence of populism in non-Western society also add something to your account of the crisis of secularism? And I think it does, because as I say here, in although Pedro here is referencing mainly Latin America, of course, you have already spoken about India, and actually you did speak about Bolsonaro as well, and so that there is there is an emergence of populism in non-Western and Western society, and in my view, this can also be traced back to this conflict between liberalism and political theology, which is not only a Western struggle, right? And to the fact that, and if we point to the fact that liberalism has kind of been exported, yes, this through colonialism, perhaps, then of course this conflict between political theology, which is not just Christianity, to be sure, yes, but it's one that has to do with the idea that divinity or divinities, have to control political power, right? So we shouldn't be surprised that this conflict between liberalism, or what you call secularism, and political theology is not a conflict of only Western societies. Okay, so I unfortunately, I think we will have to leave it at that because we only have a minute left. I'm sorry to Marca Valenta that we cannot address your question, but of course you are very free to email the panelists. I certainly welcome emails from audience members, and I can see that Daniel and Marietta so welcome them too. So first of all, I would like, before I thank our speakers, and especially Daniel, I'd like to thank our audience for participating very much in this discussion and for your very insightful questions. I would like to remind you of the series of IHSS talks that are taking on. If I may self-advertise myself, the IHSS is hosting a book launch of my book on the 22nd of February at 3 p.m. Please join us. But there are also a series of, during the month, of early career scholars training sessions. So if you are interested in this and the other events, you can find details on the IHSS website. Please have a look there. So can I take this opportunity to thank Daniel for his very insightful paper, Marietta for joining with a very interesting comments and useful comments, and Simon for the introduction. And another thanks to Anna Bonham, who has been coordinating behind the scenes and who has made this event happen. So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to our audience. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you. Thank you, and bye now.
Bye.